a suffocating mountain of debt, an eviction notice taped to the door. Then a mysterious letter hands a bankrupt nurse the keys to a notorious Victorian mansion. Locals say the estate is cursed, that its walls bleed dust and ruin. What she found hidden in the attic changed history forever. Abigail Preston's life had become an endless, agonizing cycle of fluorescent lights, flatlining monitors, and the relentless ringing of her phone. At 32, Abigail was an ER nurse at Boston General, but her title offered no financial salvation. Following a grueling 3-year battle with her late mother's aggressive leukemia, Abigail was left holding a staggering mountain of out-of-pocket medical bills. She had liquidated her savings, sold her car, and taken out predatory loans just to keep the chemotherapy treatments going. Despite her sacrifices, her mother passed away, leaving Abigail utterly alone and officially devastatingly bankrupt. The final blow came on a freezing Tuesday in November. Abigail returned to her cramped apartment to find a bright pink eviction notice taped to her door. She had exactly 14 days to vacate. She sat on her worn, hand-me-down sofa, buried her face in her hands, and wept until her chest ached. She had nothing left to sell, nowhere to go, and absolutely no hope. Then the envelope arrived. It was thick, crafted from heavy cream parchment, and bore the embossed seal of Caldwell & Davies, a prestigious downtown law firm. Assuming it was yet another aggressive debt collection agency, taking a new approach, Abigail almost threw it into the trash. But the name typed on the front caught her eye, estate of Archibald Montgomery. Archibald Montgomery. The name hit her like a physical force. 4 years ago, Archibald had been a permanent fixture in the cardiac ward, a famously cantankerous, fiercely private old man whom every other nurse avoided. He would throw his jello curse at the doctors and refuse his medication. But Abigail, recognizing the profound terror hiding behind the old man's rage, had simply pulled up a chair. She spent her unpaid meal breaks sitting with him, reading him articles from the Financial Times and playing endless rounds of gin rummy. When he was finally discharged to a private palliative facility, he had looked at her with piercing, watery eyes and said, "You are the only person in this God-forsaken city who doesn't look at me like I'm already dead." She hadn't seen or heard from him since. The next morning, Abigail sat in the mahogany-paneled office of Thomas Caldwell, a senior partner whose suit cost more than Abigail's entire nursing degree. "Mr. Montgomery passed away 3 weeks ago," Caldwell explained, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. He slid a heavy brass-bound key across the polished desk. He had no living heirs. He updated his will shortly after his stay at Boston General. "Miss Preston Archibald has left you the entirety of the Montgomery estate, specifically a property known as Ashbourne Manor, located in Berkshire County." Abigail stared at the key. "A manor I don't understand. I'm bankrupt, Mr. Caldwell. I don't have a dime to my name. If this is a house, can I sell it?" Caldwell's expression tightened, a shadow of pity crossing his features. "I must be completely transparent with you, Miss Preston. Ashbourne Manor is not a blessing. It is a profound liability. The property has been abandoned for over 2 decades. It is severely dilapidated. Worse, there are extensive liens on the property. Mr. Montgomery was land-rich, but liquid-poor in his final years. The estate owes over $180,000 in back taxes to the county. If those taxes aren't settled within the next 60 days, the state will seize the property. So I inherited a $180,000 debt." Abigail whispered, the brief spark of hope extinguishing instantly. "You inherited a choice," Caldwell corrected gently. "You can refuse the inheritance. The state takes it immediately, and you walk away clean. Or you accept it, and you have 60 days to either find a buyer willing to take on the liens or find the money yourself. With an eviction notice on her door, the choice was made for her. She had to at least see it. If she could sell the antique furniture inside, maybe she could afford a security deposit on a new apartment. 2 days later, Abigail borrowed a friend's battered Honda and drove into the deep, heavily wooded hills of Berkshire County. The GPS signal died long before she turned onto the overgrown wrought iron gates bearing the rusted letter M. As she drove up the long, winding driveway, choked with dead ivy and encroaching oak trees, Ashbourne Manor loomed into view. It was a massive, imposing Victorian behemoth. 3 stories of dark stone sharp gables and slate roofing stood stark against the grey sky. It looked less like a home and more like a mausoleum. The paint was peeling in long, diseased strips, and several of the tall, narrow windows were boarded up. When she stepped out of the car, the silence of the woods was deafening. She unlocked the heavy oak front door, pushing it open with a loud, agonizing creak. The air inside smelled of damp earth, rotting velvet, and forgotten time. Dust motes danced in the pale light, filtering through the stained glass transom. "Hello." Her voice echoed up the grand, sweeping staircase, swallowing the sound instantly. "You shouldn't be here." A voice barked from the porch. Abigail jumped, spinning around. Standing on the crumbling stone steps was an elderly woman leaning heavily on a wooden cane. She wore a thick wool coat and had eyes as sharp as flint. "I'm sorry," Abigail stammered. "I'm the new owner, Abigail Preston." The woman scoffed a bitter sound. "I'm Mrs. Gable. I live 2 miles down the ridge. Been keeping an eye on this monstrosity since Archie abandoned it." "New owner, huh? Then you're the new victim." "Excuse me. You don't know the history of Ashbourne, do you?" Mrs. Gable hobbled closer, her eyes scanning the dark facade of the house. "Archie's grandfather, Horatio Montgomery, built this place in 1891. He was a railroad tycoon, made a fortune, then lost his mind. Horatio used to wander these halls in the dead of night, screaming that the walls were whispering to him. Claimed the house was stealing his soul. He threw himself off that 3rd-floor balcony in 1898. Abigail swallowed hard, looking up at the rotting wooden railing high above. "Every person who has tried to live here since has met ruin." Mrs. Gable continued, her voice dropping to a grim whisper. "Financial ruin, madness, or sudden death. The locals call it the Ashbourne curse. The house eats its owners, Miss Preston. If you have any sense, you'll lock that door and drive back to wherever you came from." But Abigail had nowhere to go. She gripped the brass key in her pocket. "I don't believe in curses, Mrs. Gable. I believe in math. And right now, this house is the only asset I have." Desperation breeds a unique kind of courage. With her Boston apartment officially gone, Abigail moved into the ground floor of Ashbourne Manor. She had no central heating, no internet, and the plumbing only worked in the kitchen sink. She set up a camping cot in the grand parlor, huddled every night next to a portable propane heater, wrapped in 3 layers of blankets. Her days were spent in a frenzy of manic cleaning and inventory. She systematically went through the sprawling, dusty rooms, searching for anything of value. She found a few silver dining pieces, some heavy mahogany side tables, and a collection of first-edition books. She brought a local antique dealer in, praying for a miracle. The dealer offered her $6,000 for the lot, a drop in the ocean of the $180,000 she needed to save the house from foreclosure. The psychological toll of the manor began to weigh on her almost immediately. Mrs. Gable's words echoed in her mind every time the sun went down. The house didn't just settle, it groaned. In the dead of night, Abigail would wake in a cold sweat, swearing she could hear a faint, rhythmic sound, like a low, breathy whistling. "The walls are whispering," Horatio had said. Abigail tried to rationalize it. It was just the harsh Berkshire wind forcing its way through the cracks in the decaying stone. It had to be. On her 5th day in the Manor, a sleek black Mercedes SUV tore up the driveway, a jarring sight against the backdrop of overgrown decay. A man stepped out impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit and an expensive camel hair overcoat. He had the polished, predatory smile of a man who smelled blood in the water. "Miss Preston, I'm Gregory Hayes," he announced, stepping onto the porch without waiting for an invitation. He handed her a glossy business card. "Hayes Development and Holdings." "Can I help you, Mr. Hayes?" Abigail asked, pulling her thick cardigan tighter around herself. "I'm here to offer you a lifeline," Hayes said smoothly, his eyes raking over the rotting porch pillars with thinly veiled disgust. "I know about the tax liens, Miss Preston. I know you're bankrupt. The county records are public. You're sitting on a ticking time bomb, and you have exactly 48 days before the state rips this property from your hands and leaves you with nothing." Abigail's jaw tightened. "Get to the point." "I want the land. The house is a tear-down, a toxic, asbestos-filled nightmare. But the acreage has potential for a luxury subdivision. I am prepared to cut you a check today for $40,000. I will assume the tax debt. You walk away with 40 grand in your pocket and a fresh start. It's a generous offer for a cursed piece of real estate." Abigail looked at the man. Something about his urgency didn't sit right with her. A developer like Hayes wouldn't personally drive out to a decrepit estate to offer a lifeline to a bankrupt nurse unless there was an immense profit to be made. "I'll need to think about it," Abigail said coldly. Hayes's smile vanished, replaced by a cold, hard glare. "Don't be a fool, little girl. This house broke men far stronger than you. Take the money before you lose your mind or your life." He turned on his heel and strode back to his Mercedes, leaving a cloud of exhaust in his wake. Hayes's visit lit a fire under Abigail. If he wanted the property that badly, there was something she was missing. The antique furniture wasn't the prize. The land itself was heavily wooded and far from the main highways, hardly ideal for a luxury subdivision. Determined to understand what she was sitting on, Abigail drove to the county historical archives in town. She requested every file newspaper clipping and public record tied to Horatio Montgomery and the Ashbourne estate. For hours she pored over crumbling yellow documents. Horatio had indeed been a railroad titan, but the archives revealed a crucial detail Mrs. Gable had omitted. Horatio Montgomery was obsessively paranoid about banks. During the panic of 1893, when the stock market crashed and hundreds of banks failed, Horatio reportedly liquidated massive portions of his stock into untraceable hard assets. Millions of dollars vanished from his ledger. The press at the time rumored he had buried it, but nothing was ever found. Horatio died a raving lunatic, his fortune seemingly erased into thin air. Then Abigail found the original architectural blueprints for Ashbourne Manor, dated 1891. She unrolled the massive blue-tinted schematics on the library table. She traced the lines of the ground floor, the second floor, and finally the third floor attic space. She paused. She took a ruler from the librarian's desk and began to measure the scale. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs. According to the blueprints, the third floor attic spanned 80 feet across. But Abigail had walked the exterior of the house. She had cleaned the attic just 2 days ago. From the inside, the attic was only 60 feet wide. It stopped abruptly at a flat plaster wall that she had assumed was the end of the house. There was a 20-foot gap, a massive hollow space spanning the entire eastern side of the manor that did not exist on the inside, but existed on the outside. The walls are whispering. Abigail didn't wait to return the files. She ran to her car, her tires spinning in the gravel as she sped back toward the estate. The sky had turned a bruised, violent purple, signaling an incoming nor'easter storm. By the time she reached the manor, the wind was howling, rattling the loose window panes like angry spirits trying to break in. She grabbed a heavy steel crowbar from her trunk and a heavy-duty flashlight. She bypassed the ground floor and sprinted up the main staircase, her footsteps echoing like gunshots in the empty house. Up to the second floor, then up the narrower, steeper servants' stairs to the third-floor attic. The attic was freezing the air, thick with a century of dust. The storm outside lashed against the slate roof, deafeningly loud. But underneath the crash of the thunder, Abigail heard it again. Whoosh! The whisper. It was coming from the eastern wall. Abigail walked slowly toward the flat, unadorned expanse of plaster at the far end of the attic. She pressed her hand flat against the cold surface. She felt a faint, steady vibration. The wind wasn't just blowing against the house, it was blowing through the house, finding tiny cracks in a hollow void and creating a whistling vacuum effect. Horatio hadn't gone mad from ghosts. He had gone mad listening to the wind blow through his own secret vault. Abigail gripped the crowbar tightly in both hands. She took a deep breath, stepping back, and swung the heavy steel bar with everything she had. Crack! The plaster shattered. A cloud of grey, choking dust erupted into the air, causing her to cough violently. She swung again and again, adrenaline flooding her veins, erasing the cold, the bankruptcy, the fear. She was a woman with absolutely nothing left to lose, battering down the walls of her own ruin. Chunks of plaster and wooden lath rained down, revealing an inner layer of heavy, dark brick. But it wasn't a solid brick wall. It was a secondary facade. Panting, covered in white dust, Abigail shined her flashlight into the jagged hole she had created. The beam of light cut through the darkness of the hidden void. It hit the back wall and reflected back not with the dull bounce of wood or stone, but with a sharp, heavy, unmistakable gleam. Stacked floor to ceiling, stretching into the darkness, were rows upon rows of dull, yellowed bars. It was gold. Pure, untraceable late 19th century bullion. Abigail dropped the crowbar. The heavy thud of the steel against the floorboards was the only sound in the room as the reality of what she was looking at crashed over her. She reached her trembling hand through the jagged hole, her fingers brushing the cold, heavy surface of the nearest bar. She wasn't just saved. She was standing in the middle of a $250 million empire. But as her hand lingered on the gold, a distinct, slow creak echoed from the stairwell behind her. Someone else was in the house. Abigail's blood turned to ice. She slowly pulled her dust-covered hand back through the jagged hole in the plaster, her fingers numb. She snatched the heavy steel crowbar from the floorboards, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the cold metal. The heavy, rhythmic creak of the servants' stairs grew louder. The storm raging outside slammed against the slate roof, the thunder masking the intruder's approach until they were mere feet away. A flashlight beam cut through the attic's gloom, blindingly bright, sweeping over the shattered wall and settling directly on Abigail's face. "You really couldn't just take the check, could you, Miss Preston?" The voice was smooth, cultured, but laced with a venomous edge. The flashlight lowered slightly, illuminating the immaculately tailored suit and the cold, predatory eyes of Gregory Hayes. Except he wasn't carrying a briefcase this time. In his right hand, resting casually at his side, was a matte black handgun, Abigail backed up, pressing her spine against the freezing plaster of the false wall. "Hayes, you followed me." "I've been tracking you since you left the Historical Society," Hayes said, stepping fully into the attic. He kicked a chunk of broken plaster aside with his polished leather shoe. "I knew the moment you pulled Horatio's blueprints that my timeline had evaporated. I spent 3 years setting up the shell companies that bought Archibald's tax debt. I engineered your foreclosure. You were supposed to be a desperate, grieving nurse who would take my $40,000 and run. But you had to be clever. This isn't about a luxury subdivision." Abigail breathed, her eyes darting between the gun and the staircase behind him. "You knew about the gold." Hayes let out a hollow, bitter laugh. "My family has known about the gold for 130 years. My great-grandfather was Arthur Hayes. He was Horatio Montgomery's closest friend and majority partner in the Boston and Western Railroad. During the Panic of 1893, when the banks collapsed, Horatio liquidated all the company's joint assets. He didn't just steal his own money, he stole Arthur's too. He converted it all into untraceable bullion and vanished it into this grotesque monument to his own paranoia." Hayes took a slow step closer, raising the gun slightly. The sheer malice in his eyes was far more terrifying than the ghosts Mrs. Gable had warned her about. "Arthur was ruined." Hayes continued, his voice trembling with a century of generational rage. "He faced federal fraud charges while Horatio hid up here, listening to the wind whistle through 50 tons of stolen wealth until it drove him completely insane. My family lost our empire. We spent 4 generations rebuilding, searching, waiting for the Montgomery bloodline to finally die out. When Archibald croaked, I thought it was over. And then he leaves the estate to some nobody nurse who wiped his chin in the hospital." "So you're going to shoot me?" Abigail asked, forcing her voice to remain steady, despite the violent shaking of her hands. "The police know I'm here. Mrs. Gable down the road knows you're here. You discharge that weapon, and you'll spend the rest of your life in federal prison. The Ashbourne curse claims another victim," Hayes sneered, gesturing around the decaying room. "A tragic accident, a structurally compromised beam, a desperate, bankrupt woman who climbed up to the attic, slipped and broke her neck. No one will look twice." He raised the gun, leveling it directly at her chest. "Step away from the wall, Abigail." Desperation is a powerful catalyst. As Hayes stepped forward, his polished shoe landed squarely on a century-old floorboard, weakened by decades of water damage from the leaking roof. The wood let out a deafening crack and splintered downward, trapping Hayes's leg up to the knee in the joists. He stumbled forward, cursing loudly, his gun arm flailing as he fought to keep his balance. Abigail didn't hesitate. She didn't scream or run for the stairs. Instead, she drove the heavy steel crowbar directly into the massive pile of shattered plaster lath and century-old dust she had just torn from the wall, kicking it upward with all her might. A thick, blinding cloud of white, choking dust erupted directly into Hayes's face. He gasped in surprise, inhaling the toxic cloud of pulverized lime and asbestos. He doubled over in a violent fit of coughing, firing a blind shot into the ceiling. The gunshot was deafening in the confined space, ringing in Abigail's ears. She lunged forward, swinging the crowbar like a baseball bat. She didn't aim for his head, she aimed for his right arm. The steel connected with his wrist with a sickening crunch. Hayes screamed, dropping the handgun. It clattered across the floorboards and slid into the darkness. Abigail didn't wait to see if he would recover. She scrambled over his trapped, thrashing form, bolted down the narrow servants' stairs, and slammed the heavy oak door behind her, sliding the heavy iron deadbolt into place. She could hear him screaming and throwing his weight against the wood, but the Victorian iron held. She ran to the second floor, pulled her cell phone from her pocket and dialed 911. "My name is Abigail Preston," she gasped into the receiver, sliding down the wall of the master bedroom, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I'm at Ashbourne Manor. Send the police. Send everyone." Within 20 minutes, the isolated Berkshire Hills were ablaze with the flashing red and blue lights of state trooper cruisers. Gregory Hayes was dragged out of the manor in handcuffs covered in plaster dust and cradling a shattered wrist. He was shouting about stolen birthrights and empires, looking every bit as insane as Horatio Montgomery had a century prior. But the real chaos began when the police went up to the attic to clear the crime scene. By sunrise, Ashbourne Manor was swarming with local police, FBI agents, and federal tax investigators. The property was wrapped in miles of yellow tape. News helicopters circled overhead, like vultures broadcasting the incredible discovery to the entire world. The hidden void behind the false attic wall held precisely 400,000 ounces of late 19th century gold bullion. Each bar was deeply stamped with the insignia of the Homestake Mining Company. The estimated market value was a staggering $250 million. However, finding the gold was only the beginning of the most grueling battle of Abigail's life. The moment the value was authenticated by senior appraisers from Sotheby's, the predators began circling. The state of Massachusetts immediately filed an injunction attempting to claim the gold under ancient treasure trove laws, arguing the bullion was abandoned property and therefore belonged to the Commonwealth. Simultaneously, the IRS descended, freezing the asset pending a massive federal investigation into Horatio's 1893 tax records. Abigail knew she was completely out of her depth. She was a bankrupt ER nurse, not a corporate raider. But she also knew she was fighting for her survival. Using her story as leverage, she managed to secure representation from Baker McKenzie, one of the most ruthless and powerful multinational law firms in the world. Her lead attorney, a razor-sharp litigator named Harrison Croft, took the case on contingency, captivated by the sheer historical precedent of the dispute. For 8 agonizing months, Abigail lived in a modest hotel fronted by her legal team, while the battle raged in federal court. The state's argument was simple. Horatio Montgomery hid the gold. He never explicitly willed it to Archibald, therefore it was abandoned treasure. But Croft deployed a brilliant, unorthodox legal strategy. He didn't argue probate law, he argued real estate law. "Your Honor," Croft stated during the final hearing, standing before a packed federal courtroom, "this is not a chest of coins buried in a backyard. Horatio Montgomery literally built the gold into the physical structure of Ashbourne Manor. The bullion served as the inner load-bearing facade of the eastern attic wall. Under established Massachusetts property law, any item physically integrated into a property becomes a fixture. My client, Miss Preston, legally inherited the deed to Ashbourne Manor in its entirety. Therefore, she did not find abandoned treasure. She simply inherited a very, very expensive wall." The courtroom erupted. The legal loophole was absolute genius. Because the gold was structurally mortared into the framework of the house, it was legally indistinguishable from the bricks, the plumbing, or the slate roof. On an unseasonably warm morning in August, the federal judge ruled in Abigail's favor. After federal estate taxes, capital gains, and her towering legal fees, Abigail Preston walked out of the courthouse with a liquid net worth of $142 million. Her first act was to write a check for $180,000 and hand it directly to the Berkshire County Tax Commissioner, clearing the liens on Ashbourne Manor forever. Her second act was to pay off the remaining $64,000 of her late mother's medical debts. She didn't demolish the manor. Instead, she poured millions into a meticulous, historically accurate restoration. She hired master craftsmen to repair the slate roof, restore the stained glass transoms, and strip away the decades of rot. She installed state-of-the-art heating, modern plumbing, and transformed the dark, imposing mausoleum into a sprawling, sunlit estate. The whispers in the walls were finally silenced, replaced by the hum of life. But Abigail hadn't forgotten the brutal reality of the hospital wards, the fluorescent lights, or the crushing weight of the pink eviction notice. She took the majority of her newfound wealth and established the Montgomery Preston Foundation. Operating directly out of the newly restored first-floor library of Ashbourne Manor, the foundation had one singular mission: aggressively purchasing and forgiving the medical debt of terminally ill patients across New England. She ensured that no family would ever have to choose between life-saving chemotherapy and keeping a roof over their heads. 2 years after the discovery, Abigail stood on the grand wraparound porch of the manor, sipping a cup of hot coffee. The morning air was crisp, and the Berkshire woods were alive with the vibrant colors of autumn. Down at the bottom of the long, newly paved driveway, she saw Mrs. Gable taking her morning walk. The elderly woman stopped, leaning heavily on her cane, and looked up at the stunningly restored estate. Abigail raised her coffee mug in a silent greeting. Mrs. Gable stared for a long moment. Then, for the first time, she offered a small, genuine smile, returning the nod before continuing her walk. The Ashbourne curse was broken. Horatio Montgomery's paranoia and Arthur Hayes's ruin had birthed a century of darkness, but a bankrupt nurse with a crowbar had finally let the light back in. The walls of the manor no longer bled dust and ruin. They stood as a fortress of hope built on a foundation of gold. What would you do if you found $250 million hidden in the walls of a cursed house? Abigail's unbelievable true journey from a bankrupt nurse facing eviction to a millionaire philanthropist proves that sometimes our darkest moments lead to our greatest treasures. If this story of justice, historical twists, and ultimate triumph kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button. Don't forget to share this incredible tale with your friends and subscribe to the channel for more unbelievable real-life mysteries.